Well, Niall, thank you very much indeed, and it's a great honour to be here speaking at the appropriately named Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. And the sad passing of Baroness Thatcher last month reminded, I thought, Conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic of the values that we hold in common. And I'm delighted to be contributing in my own small way to the great dialogue of ideas which has always existed between our two countries. And it's relevant today because Margaret Thatcher's view of capitalism has a very contemporary bearing, I feel, on the debate about how we fix the relationship between the financial system and the economy that it exists to support. And this is at the centre of Masters of Nothing, the book that we are launching this week. It's because throughout her life, Lady Thatcher passionately believed that capitalism was not only the most effective form of economic organisation that had ever been invented, but also the most moral. And today, the first of those points is almost undisputed, and we should all be grateful to the market liberals of West and of East, who, in freeing the peoples of the former communist bloc through thought and through deed, so liberated billions in China and India and Indonesia and beyond from grinding poverty, and proved once and for all that free markets are the greatest source of prosperity ever known to man. But that the free market is a moral force for good is less well understood. And this moral authority hinges, I think, on two crucial factors. First, that free markets are fair because reward is proportionate to effort. When markets work, those who prosper are those who work hard and risk their capital to succeed in making other people's lives, their customers' lives, better. And for most people, fairness is a form of reciprocity, that you get out according to what you put in. And for most people, this is more important than fairness as equality. And free markets make that principle real. But second, free markets support personal responsibility. If the state takes responsibility away from people, then people tend to behave irresponsibly. From, in Britain, the shabby management of our nationalised industries in the 1970s through to the irresponsible spending of the 2000s, the examples are legion, and Margaret Thatcher held that the way people behave and the moral implications of that behaviour should be at the very heart of how we think about capitalism. She supported small business, the challenger, the entrepreneur, not the corporate giant distorting the market, whether in the public sector or the private sector. And we must do the same. For too long, from before the crisis, for instance, middle-income pay packets, both here and at home, have stagnated. And we on the political right must have and show that we have the answers to ensure everyone can benefit from the prosperity the market can generate. So I'm not one of those conservatives who looks at the many mistakes by government and concludes that the private sector has no case to answer. The fact is that before the crash, a lot of people, especially in the finance industry, got very rich, not by making money for their clients, but by making money from them. And the moral underpinnings of free markets, of personal responsibility, and of something for something, that reciprocity, were badly undermined by this behaviour. And we argue in this book, Masters of Nothing, that that happened because the markets at work were not truly free. There's a story in the book about a Minnesota assistant who was investigating AmeriQuest back in 2003. He'd ordered them to hand over a sample of their loan data, and one day 10 boxes of files arrived at his office. And he pulled one out at random and found the borrower was listed as an antiques dealer. And then he went through these boxes of files, and he pulled out another and another, and every file said the same thing. Every file listed the borrower as an antiques dealer. And clearly the loans were fraudulent, but they'd already been bundled up and sold on. And you can blame government for making life easier for companies like AmeriQuest. If lending to people with poor credit has explicit political backing, then of course the AmeriQuests of this world will be able to operate with greater impunity. But by focusing solely on government's failings, there's a danger that we tacitly excuse the behaviour of the loan officers who lied on the forms and the Wall Street banks who packaged the loans up without asking the difficult questions, and the rating agencies who closed their eyes and put a triple A on the finished securities. In his famous essay, Milton Friedman wrote, "The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits." But rather too many people on Wall Street seem to have read the title and ignored the argument, for Friedman goes on to say that it is the social responsibility of business to make, and I quote, "as much money as possible while conforming to the basic rules of society, both those embodied in law and embodied in ethical custom." Ethical custom. Some on the right have taken the crisis as evidence that government should get out of the business of trying to manage the economy altogether. And this book very much argues that it is the role of government to recognise our flaws and all of our failings, but to ensure that we regulate appropriately rather than not at all. John Allison from the Cato Institute has recently suggested that we abolish central banking and deposit insurance and move back to a system of private money based on gold. It's an argument that you hear occasionally on the right. But in fact, we already have a system of private money because the difference between what banks take in as deposits and what they choose to lend out is indeed private money. History shows that collectively, banks sometimes make the wrong call on how much money to create, even when the individual banks have the right decision for them. And in the century or so before the Fed was founded, the US experienced 5 major banking panics with numerous smaller ones in between. The panic of 1873, which coincided with the bursting of the railway bubble, for instance, triggered a global recession which lasted for 9 years. So I'm sceptical of the idea that eliminating central banking and management of the economy is the answer to all our problems, not least because the global financial system is infinitely more complex and interconnected than in the 1870s. And indeed, in the book, we go back further and widen our perspective to look at the whole panorama of financial crises, from tulip mania to the tech bubble. And it becomes clear that there's one constant. And the constant is not central banking or deposit insurance, but the constant is human nature. At the height of the South Sea bubble in 1720, dozens of fictitious trading companies were set up to cash in on the public appetite for company stock. And in one famous example, stock was issued on behalf of, and I quote, "a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is." It sold very well. And we can laugh today at the credulity of the 18th century investor and how much smarter we are now. Who ever would invest in such a product? But are we smarter? Were the purchasers of synthetic CDOs any wiser? I think the most dangerous idea in economics is the delusion that the economy exists independently of the flaws and failures of people. From that idea flows the assumption that a self-interested decision is always a rational and well-informed one, and from that, in turn, flows much of modern economics. But let me ask you this. Who thinks that they're always rational? And who thinks their friends are always rational? For Masters of Nothing, we asked a representative sample of the American public these questions. 48% of the American public